September 11th, 2001, Kandahar, Afghanistan. Just before dawn, Osama bin Laden listened to the radio in silence. The reports were chaotic. A plane in New York, another in Washington, a third missing. At first, even he did not grasp the scale. This was not the controlled strike he had rehearsed for years. This was something far larger and far more dangerous. Because the moment the towers fell, the plan was no longer his. Within hours, the most powerful military coalition in human history would be coming for him. And in that pursuit, something far more enduring than Al-Qaeda would be unleashed. That morning, nearly 7,000 miles away, the 20th century ended in fire and dust. But the most important consequences of that day would not be felt in Manhattan. They would unfold in places already broken. To understand the shadow armies of the modern world, you must understand a mistake, shared by militants and superpowers alike. The belief that force, once unleashed, can still be controlled. These groups were not born on September 11th. They were shaped decades earlier, in the wreckage of proxy wars and abandoned battlefields. In the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, victory came without a future. Fighters returned home to regimes that feared them, economies that had no place for them, and a world that quickly forgot them. What remained was experience, networks, and a dangerous lesson: empires could be wounded. Bin Laden believed the attacks would shock the West into retreat. Instead, they triggered an era of permanent war, one that created more fighters than it killed. This is the paradox at the heart of modern conflict. The shadow armies do not need to defeat states. They only need states to overreact. They embed themselves where bombs cannot discriminate, inside cities, families, religions, and grievances. They turn retaliation into recruitment. Every checkpoint, every prison, every civilian funeral becomes a quiet transaction. By the time governments realized they were not fighting armies but ecosystems, the pattern was already set. The response to 9/11 would topple regimes, redraw borders, and destabilize entire regions. But it would also do something far more dangerous. It would teach militant groups how to survive forever, not by winning wars, but by outlasting them. And as the first American aircraft lifted off toward Afghanistan, the shadows did not retreat. They adapted. October 7th, 2001, Afghanistan-Pakistan border. The first American bombs did not miss. They struck training camps, air defenses, command posts, exactly what a modern military is designed to destroy. Taliban front lines collapsed within weeks. Kabul fell. Journalists spoke of shock and awe. Politicians spoke of justice. But in the mountains east of Jalalabad, something else was happening. As U.S. aircraft pounded the caves of Tora Bora, the men they were meant to kill were already moving. Not in convoys, not in columns, on foot, through goat paths and frozen passes, guided by locals who knew the terrain better than any satellite. The war had barely begun, and its most important targets had slipped away. This was the second great illusion of the war on terror, that victory looked like territory taken rather than enemies dispersed. By early 2002, Al-Qaeda no longer resembled an organization. It had become a template. Veterans scattered across Pakistan, Yemen, Iraq, and North Africa, carrying with them hard-earned knowledge, how to build cells that could survive decapitation, how to operate without headquarters, how to weaponize chaos itself. Then came Iraq. In March 2003, U.S. forces invaded with stunning speed. Baghdad fell in weeks. Saddam Hussein's regime collapsed almost overnight. But when the old state was dismantled, nothing solid replaced it. Hundreds of thousands of armed men were suddenly unemployed, humiliated, and angry. Into that vacuum stepped a man who understood something Washington did not. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi believed brutality was not a liability, it was a strategy. Car bombs in marketplaces, sectarian assassinations, beheadings filmed and distributed online. His goal was not to defeat the U.S. military, it was to make Iraq ungovernable, and it worked. Every explosion widened sectarian cracks. Every raid created new enemies. Prisons meant to neutralize insurgents became universities of extremism. Camp Bucca, a U.S. detention facility in southern Iraq, quietly brought future leaders together under one roof. This was not an accident of war. It was the ecosystem the shadow armies needed. By the mid-2000s, a new kind of militant movement had emerged, one that did not rely on secrecy alone, but on provocation. The more powerful the response, the stronger the narrative. The more civilians caught in the middle, the easier recruitment became. The war on terror was no longer chasing enemies. It was manufacturing successors. And somewhere in the wreckage of Iraq, a quieter transformation was underway, one that would soon take the idea of shadow warfare further than anyone imagined. June 29, 2014, Mosul, Iraq. At exactly midday, the man stepped onto the pulpit of the great mosque of Al-Nuri. He wore black. He spoke calmly. And with a few deliberate sentences, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi did something no modern militant leader had dared to do. He made the shadows visible. By declaring a caliphate, Baghdadi abandoned the logic of survival and replaced it with the promise of destiny. This was not an insurgency hiding from the world. It was a state challenging it. For fighters hardened by years of chaos, the appeal was irresistible. ISIS offered salaries, homes, wives, power, and something more dangerous than any weapon: certainty. Borders drawn by colonial powers were declared meaningless. Loyalty was no longer to a nation, but to an idea. And for a brief moment, it worked. ISIS seized oil fields, border crossings, entire cities. Its fighters drove captured American vehicles through streets abandoned by fleeing armies. In Raqqa and Mosul, bureaucrats replaced warlords. Taxes were collected. Courts ruled. Children were taught a new version of history. But the true innovation of ISIS was not territorial. It was psychological. Every execution was filmed not to intimidate locals, but to polarize the world. Every atrocity was an invitation, designed to force governments into wars that could never be clean, never be short, and never be finished. The response was inevitable. By 2015, an unlikely coalition formed. American air power, Kurdish fighters, Iraqi militias, Iranian advisors, enemies aligned by necessity. Block by block, the caliphate was crushed. But the destruction came at a cost rarely shown in victory speeches. Entire neighborhoods were erased. Tens of thousands of civilians were buried beneath the ruins of liberation. The idea of the caliphate died in public, but the men who believed in it did not. When Baghdadi killed himself during a U.S. raid in 2019, the world declared ISIS defeated. It was wrong. The organization did what shadow armies do best. It adapted. Cells dissolved into deserts, mountains, and cities. Affiliates expanded across Africa and Asia, thriving in regions plagued by weak governments and endless war. The caliphate had failed, but it had proven something essential. Terrorism could become a state, and if a state could fall, then an insurgency could survive indefinitely. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, another movement was quietly proving the opposite lesson. You did not need spectacle to win. You only needed time. August 15, 2021. Kabul, Afghanistan. The city fell without a battle. Taliban fighters rode into Kabul on motorcycles, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Government offices stood unlocked. Soldiers vanished into the crowd. Inside the presidential palace, half-finished meals still sat on polished tables. For 20 years, Western planners had assumed this moment would never come, or at least not like this. The assumption was simple and fatal, that legitimacy could be built faster than patience could endure. It was wrong. The Taliban did not defeat a superpower militarily. They defeated it psychologically. They governed just enough to be remembered, resisted just enough to be feared, and waited long enough to be inevitable. When the moment arrived, power transferred not through conquest, but collapse. This is why Kabul mattered more than any battlefield victory ISIS ever claimed. ISIS ruled through spectacle, the Taliban ruled through expectation. One shocked the world, the other convinced it, and militant groups everywhere noticed the difference. Legitimacy, even brutal, limited legitimacy, proved more durable than terror alone. Governance, however crude, outlasted ideology shouted from the shadows. The lesson was unmistakable. You don't need to win hearts, only to outlast alternatives. This realization quietly fractured the militant world. In Gaza, Hamas adjusted its strategy. Survival became proof of authority. Rockets were no longer about victory, but visibility. Governance under siege became a narrative weapon. We remain, therefore we are legitimate. Hezbollah had already mastered this equation years earlier. Its power did not come from firing the most missiles, but from knowing exactly when to stop. Each confrontation with Israel was designed not to triumph, but to demonstrate restraint, control, and cost. A militia that knew when not to fight became something more dangerous, a permanent actor. Africa revealed the darkest version of this evolution. In northeastern Nigeria, Boko Haram fighters forced villagers to choose, pay taxes or watch your children taken. In 2014, more than 270 schoolgirls were abducted from Chibok, not for ransom, but as a message. The Nigerian state could not protect its future. Even when Boko Haram fractured under pressure, the violence did not end. It spread outward, mutating into factions that survived by terrorizing communities into silence. In Somalia, al-Shabaab executed a different strategy. It bombed Mogadishu not to seize power, but to prove the government never truly had it. After the 2017 truck bombing killed over 500 civilians, the message was unmistakable. No checkpoint, no election, no foreign mission could guarantee safety. Authority without protection was an illusion. By the early 2020s, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Shadow armies were no longer reacting to war. They were learning from it, refining what worked, discarding what didn't. Spectacle gave way to endurance. Chaos gave way to administration. Violence became quieter, more selective, more sustainable. For states, this created a trap with no clean exit. Escalation validated the narrative. Withdrawal confirmed it. Negotiation risked legitimizing it. Every option carried consequence. Every mistake echoed for decades. And here is the uncomfortable question few were willing to ask. If modern wars produce shadow armies, what happens as warfare itself evolves? As drones replace soldiers, as AI accelerates targeting, as conflicts become cheaper, faster, and more deniable. The shadows do not disappear, they multiply. Because the next generation of shadow armies may not be waiting in failed states. They may be forming inside modern ones.